There comes a moment in some people's lives when a painful realization quietly settles into their chest. No one is coming. No one is arriving to rescue them from their confusion, their loneliness, their fear, or the weight they have been carrying for years in silence. No mentor suddenly appears. No family member finally understands. No friend magically becomes the support system they spent their entire life hoping for. And for most people, that realization feels devastating at first, because human beings are wired to seek reassurance. We want someone to tell us we're doing the right thing. We want confirmation that we're not wasting our lives. We want someone to stand beside us and say, "I believe in you," especially when we no longer know how to believe in ourselves. But Jung noticed something deeply uncomfortable about this need. The people who became psychologically strongest were very often the people who had no choice but to survive without it. Not because they wanted to, not because isolation is romantic, but because life removed every external source of certainty until the only thing left was the relationship they built with themselves, and that changes a person at the deepest possible level. Modern culture constantly reinforces the idea that confidence comes from encouragement, that self-worth is built through praise, validation, recognition, and support. And to some extent that is true. Human beings do need love. Children especially need emotional reflection in order to develop healthy identity structures. Jung never denied this, but he also discovered another reality that most people avoid discussing because it sounds too harsh, too uncomfortable, too psychologically dangerous. Sometimes the absence of support creates a kind of inner authority that support itself never could. Because when no one believes in you, something inside you is eventually forced to answer a terrifying question. Will you still continue without applause? Most people never have to confront that question fully. They receive just enough validation to remain psychologically dependent on it. Just enough reassurance to keep looking outward every time they need certainty. Their confidence becomes conditional. Their motivation becomes tied to external response. Their sense of identity rises and collapses depending on who supports them and who doesn't. And that creates fragility, because anything built entirely on external reinforcement eventually shakes when the reinforcement disappears. But Jung observed that people who were forced into emotional solitude often developed something radically different, a form of self-trust that did not depend on constant encouragement. Not loud confidence, not arrogance, something much quieter, much deeper. A relationship with themselves that became stronger precisely because nobody else carried them. And this usually begins in pain. It begins when someone slowly realizes that the people they expected support from are emotionally unavailable. Parents who never saw them clearly. Friends who only supported versions of them that remained small and familiar. Partners who became uncomfortable the moment growth began. Environments where authenticity was ignored, mocked, or treated like a threat. At first, this creates enormous suffering, because the human psyche naturally wants reflection. We want to feel witnessed. We want someone to recognize what we are trying to become before we fully become it ourselves. But when that reflection never comes, something critical happens. The psyche reaches a crossroads. Either the person collapses into permanent self-doubt, or they begin building identity from the inside out. Jung would have described this as a brutal form of individuation. Individuation is the process of becoming psychologically whole, of separating your authentic identity from the expectations, projections, and conditioning imposed by the external world. Most people move through this process gradually, slowly, inconsistently. They still rely heavily on external mirrors while trying to discover themselves. But some people are pushed into individuation violently. Life removes the mirrors entirely. No encouragement, no validation, no emotional safety net. And in that vacuum, the person is forced to confront themselves directly. Not the socially approved version, not the performance, the real self underneath all of it. And while this process feels lonely beyond words, Jung noticed that it often produced individuals with an unusually stable psychological core. Because they stopped building identity around approval, they stopped asking, "Do people believe in me?" and started asking, "Do I believe in what I'm becoming even when nobody else can see it yet?" That question changes everything, because the moment your direction no longer depends entirely on external validation, Your life begins to belong to you in a completely different way. Most people don't realize how deeply controlled they are by the need to be emotionally confirmed by others. It shapes careers, relationships, goals, even personality itself. People stay small because being accepted feels safer than becoming authentic. They abandon dreams because nobody around them understands them. They silence parts of themselves to preserve belonging. But Jung observed something remarkable in individuals who had already lost belonging long before they lost themselves. Once someone survives emotional abandonment psychologically, external disapproval loses much of its power. Not completely, they still feel pain, they still feel loneliness, but they stop needing permission to exist as themselves, and this creates a kind of freedom that most people never experience. A freedom built not from confidence, but from necessity. Because eventually, the unsupported person realizes something irreversible. If no one is coming to validate the path, then the path must be walked anyway. And that realization produces a psychological shift that changes how someone moves through life forever. They become less reactive to praise, less destroyed by criticism, less dependent on being understood immediately. Because they have already spent years moving forward without those things, and contrary to what people think, this does not make them cold. It makes them internally anchored. There is a huge difference. Cold people stop feeling. Anchored people simply stop outsourcing their identity. Jung found that externally supported individuals often struggled profoundly the moment support disappeared. Their motivation collapsed because it had always depended on reflection from outside sources. But individuals who learned to survive psychologically alone developed what he called an inner orientation. They could continue moving forward even in complete silence, even when nobody clapped, even when nobody understood, even when the external world offered absolutely no evidence that success was guaranteed. And this is where most people break, because reality becomes terrifying when there is no applause confirming that you're on the right path. You begin questioning everything: your abilities, your purpose, your direction, your worth, especially when everyone around you appears to be receiving support that you never received. And yet Jung noticed that some individuals passed directly through that psychological fire instead of retreating from it. Not because they were fearless, but because eventually they understood something profound. Waiting for validation was costing them their life. So they stopped waiting, and slowly, painfully, they began building self-respect through action instead of approval. That is the part most people misunderstand. Real confidence is rarely born from praise. It is born from surviving moments where nobody believed in you, and continuing anyway. Because every time you move forward without external confirmation, you strengthen something inside yourself that cannot be built any other way. You stop needing constant reassurance to act. You stop treating uncertainty as proof you should quit. You stop interpreting loneliness as evidence you're failing. And instead, loneliness becomes part of the initiation itself. Jung believed that psychological transformation often requires separation from collective approval, because the moment a person begins becoming truly themselves, they inevitably threaten the unconscious expectations of the people around them. Growth changes relational dynamics, and people often resist the transformation of someone they unconsciously depended on remaining familiar. That is why unsupported people frequently experience isolation precisely when they begin evolving. Not because they're wrong, but because authenticity disrupts existing systems. And most people would rather preserve familiarity than confront transformation. So if you feel alone right now, if nobody understands the direction you're trying to move toward, if your growth has cost you connection, Jung would likely tell you something difficult but liberating. This does not automatically mean you're lost. It may mean you're finally separating from identities that were never truly yours to begin with. And separation always feels lonely before it feels freeing, especially at the beginning, because the unsupported person carries a particular kind of grief. Not only grief for what they lacked, but grief for what they kept hoping would eventually appear. The support, the encouragement, the emotional rescue. The moment someone finally says, "I see who you are becoming." But one of the hardest psychological truths Jung ever uncovered is this: sometimes nobody says it. Sometimes the becoming must happen in silence first. And the people who eventually build extraordinary lives are often the people who learned how to continue through that silence without abandoning themselves inside it. They no longer needed agreement in order to trust themselves. And that changes a human being more than almost anything else ever can. Most people don't realize how deeply their identity depends on external confirmation until that confirmation disappears. They think they know who they are, but the moment criticism appears, rejection happens, or support is withdrawn, their entire sense of direction begins collapsing inward. Why? Because their identity was never truly internal. It was reflected back to them by other people, by praise, by approval, by recognition, by belonging. And when those mirrors disappear, they no longer know how to see themselves clearly. Jung found this fascinating because the people who developed the strongest psychological foundations were often the people who had no mirrors left to rely on. They were forced into direct confrontation with themselves, forced to discover whether there was anything inside them capable of standing without applause. And some people, faced with that isolation, became extraordinarily strong, but many others became consumed by resentment. This distinction mattered enormously to Jung because externally the two people can look almost identical. Both work hard, both become disciplined, both achieve impressive things, both appear driven and focused. But internally, they are operating from completely different psychological realities. One is building from sovereignty, the other is building from pain, and eventually that difference changes everything. Because resentment is one of the most deceptive forms of motivation a human being can experience. It feels powerful. In many ways, it is powerful. A wounded person trying to prove themselves can generate almost superhuman levels of discipline. They wake up earlier, work harder, push further. They become obsessed with success because success feels emotionally loaded with meaning. I'll prove them wrong. I'll make them regret underestimating me. One day they'll finally see my value. This energy can build businesses, careers, bodies, money, status. Entire lives can be constructed from unresolved emotional injury. But Jung noticed something deeply tragic about people driven entirely by resentment. No matter how much they achieved, they were never psychologically free because the people they were trying to escape remained at the center of their inner world. That is the trap. Most people think resentment creates independence. In reality, it often creates invisible bondage. Because if your entire life is built around proving someone wrong, then they still control you emotionally. Your motivation still revolves around their rejection. Your identity still forms in reaction to their absence of belief. You may become successful, but psychologically you are still performing for the same empty audience. And the cruelest part is this. Very often the audience isn't even watching anymore. The father who never cared still doesn't care. The people who doubted you have moved on with their lives. The person you wanted recognition from may never acknowledge what you've become. And suddenly you find yourself standing on top of achievements that were supposed to heal you, feeling strangely empty inside. Jung saw this pattern repeatedly. People would spend decades chasing accomplishment, believing success would finally erase the wound of being unseen. But external achievement cannot repair internal abandonment. No amount of money, recognition, status, or admiration can fully heal a part of you that still feels emotionally rejected. Because the deeper wound was never about success. It was about love, about being witnessed, about wanting someone important to say, "You matter." And when that need remains unconscious, people spend entire lives converting grief into ambition, without realizing the ambition itself is still chained to pain. Jung believed this was one of the shadow's most dangerous disguises. Most people think the shadow only contains ugly traits like anger, selfishness, or aggression. But the shadow also contains abandoned grief, unprocessed loneliness, the parts of ourselves we learned were unsafe to feel openly. And unsupported people often carry enormous amounts of hidden grief inside them. Grief for the encouragement they never received. Grief for the childhood safety they never had. Grief for the emotional support they kept hoping would eventually appear. But instead of grieving those losses directly, many people turn them into fuel. And for a while, that fuel works. Pain can make people incredibly productive. But productivity is not the same thing as peace. And eventually the nervous system begins to collapse under the weight of carrying unresolved emotional hunger for too long. Because resentment is exhausting, it forces you to remain psychologically connected to the very people you claim to have outgrown. That is why some successful people still feel emotionally trapped decades later. They achieved everything they thought would heal them, but internally they are still trying to win approval from ghosts, still trying to prove they deserved love, still trying to finally become valuable enough to be chosen. And Jung understood something most people never realize. You cannot achieve your way out of emotional abandonment. You cannot perform your way into feeling worthy. You cannot build enough external success to permanently silence an inner wound that was never truly faced. At some point, the grief itself has to be acknowledged, not avoided, not converted into endless ambition. Actually grieved, and this is where the path changes completely. Because the people Jung saw truly transform were not the people who became the most resentfully successful. They were the people who eventually stopped waiting for the support, stopped waiting for validation, stopped waiting for someone to finally recognize what they were becoming. And, instead of turning bitterness into identity, they mourned what they never received. That sounds simple. It isn't. It is one of the hardest psychological transitions a human being can go through. Because grieving unsupportedness means accepting something painful. The version of love, encouragement, and emotional protection you hoped would eventually arrive may never come in the form you wanted. And the ego hates this realization. It keeps bargaining. Maybe if I succeed enough, maybe if I become impressive enough, maybe if I finally win, then the people who ignored me will suddenly see me differently. But Jung understood that healing begins when the bargaining stops. When someone finally says, "It happened. I was unsupported, I was unseen, I was emotionally alone in ways I should never have been." And instead of spending the rest of their life trying to reverse the past, they begin building from the present. That is sovereignty, not becoming emotionless, not pretending the pain never existed, but no longer organizing your entire identity around the wound. The sovereign person still remembers what happened. They still carry scars, but their life is no longer built as a reaction to rejection. It becomes an expression of truth instead, and that changes the energy behind everything they do. They stop creating in order to prove value, and begin creating because the expression itself feels real. They stop chasing applause, and begin listening to whether their own soul recognizes what they are building. They stop measuring themselves through external reaction, and begin asking a much deeper question. Does this life actually belong to me? Jung believed that most people never reach this stage because it requires letting go of fantasy. The fantasy that one day the people who wounded you will fully understand you. The fantasy that success will erase loneliness. The fantasy that external recognition can permanently replace internal wholeness. But when those fantasies finally collapse, something unexpectedly powerful begins emerging underneath them. Freedom, real freedom. Not freedom from pain, freedom from dependence, freedom from needing everyone to understand you before you allow yourself to become who you are. And once someone reaches that point, their entire relationship with life changes, because they are no longer building in order to heal the wound. They are building from the part of themselves that survived it. Everything changed the moment their psychology stopped moving outward and started moving inward. That was the real shift Jung observed. Not confidence, not motivation, not success, orientation. The unsupported people who eventually became psychologically powerful were the ones who stopped building their lives as reactions to rejection and started building them as expressions of who they actually were. And those are completely different ways of living. Most people never notice the difference because externally they can look almost identical. Both people work hard. Both stay disciplined. Both become ambitious. Both appear driven. But internally, one person is still emotionally chained to the people who failed them, while the other has finally become free. Jung believed this distinction determined almost everything about the quality of a person's life. Because when your motivation is built around reaction, your identity never fully belongs to you. You're still psychologically orbiting the wound, still trying to emotionally resolve the past through future achievement. But sovereignty changes the center completely. The work stops being, "One day they'll see my value," and becomes, "This is who I am, whether anyone sees it or not." That shift sounds small. It isn't. It is one of the deepest psychological transformations a human being can experience. Because the unsupported person eventually reaches a point where they realize something painful but liberating. The encouragement they've been waiting for may never come. No one is suddenly going to appear and say all the right things. The people who overlooked them may never understand them. The emotional support they spent years hoping would finally arrive may simply not exist in the form they imagined. And this realization breaks people open. At first, it feels unbearable, because hidden underneath ambition, productivity, and discipline was often a quiet fantasy. If I just become enough, someone will finally love me correctly. Jung understood that this fantasy controls far more human behavior than people realize. Entire careers are built on it. People exhaust themselves chasing validation disguised as success. They become addicted to achievement, not because achievement fulfills them, but because somewhere deep inside they still believe the next accomplishment will finally heal the original wound. But it never does, because achievement cannot travel backward through time and give you the emotional foundation you lacked when you needed it most. And this is where grief becomes necessary. Real grief. Not intellectual understanding, not motivational speeches. Actual mourning. Mourning the support you deserved, but never received. Mourning the people who could not love you in the way you needed. Mourning the fact that certain emotional absences shaped your life far more deeply than anyone around you ever realized. Most people spend their entire lives avoiding this grief. They convert it into productivity, into busyness, into proving energy, into constant striving, because slowing down long enough to actually feel the abandonment underneath everything feels terrifying. But Jung noticed something extraordinary about the people who allowed themselves to grieve fully. After the grief came quietness, not defeat, not hopelessness, quietness. A different kind of internal atmosphere. The compulsive need to prove themselves began dissolving. The endless hunger for recognition started losing intensity. And underneath all the noise, they discovered something they had never truly built before. An internal relationship with themselves, not based on performance, not based on comparison, not based on external reaction. Something far more stable. For the first time, their actions stopped being desperate attempts to finally become worthy in someone else's eyes, and started becoming expressions of truth. This is what sovereignty actually looks like psychologically. Not domination, not emotional numbness, not pretending you no longer care what anyone thinks. Sovereignty means your center of gravity moves inward. You stop measuring your life entirely through external reflection. You stop asking whether people approve before trusting your own perception. You stop needing applause to justify your existence. And once that happens, your relationship with work changes completely. The sovereign person still works hard, sometimes even harder than before. But the energy is different. There is less desperation in it, less panic, less emotional hunger attached to every outcome, because they are no longer building in order to repair identity. They are building because creation itself has become aligned with who they genuinely are. That difference changes the entire emotional texture of life. Work becomes cleaner psychologically. You no longer need every achievement to emotionally rescue you. You no longer collapse every time someone misunderstands your path. You no longer feel destroyed when people fail to notice your effort, because your sense of meaning no longer depends entirely on external recognition. Jung believed this was one of the clearest signs of psychological maturation, the ability to continue moving toward what feels true even when external validation is absent. Not because you're emotionless, but because your relationship with yourself has become strong enough to hold the weight of uncertainty. And uncertainty is unavoidable on any meaningful path, especially when you're becoming someone nobody around you fully understands yet. Most people quit long before they fail. They quit when they stop receiving emotional reinforcement. The silence breaks them. No applause, no encouragement, no reassurance that they're doing the right thing. And suddenly the mind begins attacking itself. What if this is pointless? What if I'm delusional? What if everyone else was right about me? Jung understood that unsupported people face this psychological battle constantly, because when no one externally reflects belief back to you, you are forced to generate belief internally or collapse under the absence of it. And this is where the proving wound becomes dangerous. The proving wound disguises itself brilliantly. It sounds like ambition, looks like discipline, feels like determination. But underneath it is still the abandoned child desperately trying to become impressive enough to finally deserve love. That is why some people can never rest. No accomplishment ever feels complete. No success feels satisfying. For long, the moment one goal is reached, anxiety immediately redirects toward the next one. Because the nervous system isn't actually seeking fulfillment, it's seeking emotional resolution. And no external achievement can permanently provide that. You can recognize the proving wound by the emotional quality attached to your work. Does success feel grounding or urgent? Does accomplishment bring peace or temporary relief followed immediately by pressure again? Can you celebrate, or do you instantly feel behind no matter how much you've achieved? These questions matter because a person trapped inside the proving wound can build an externally impressive life while remaining internally exhausted forever. Jung believed many highly successful people were secretly prisoners of unresolved emotional hunger. They appeared powerful, but psychologically, they were still begging to be chosen, still begging to be enough, still unconsciously performing for people who never truly saw them. And eventually that creates emptiness no amount of achievement can solve. Because the wound was never about productivity, it was about love, about emotional safety, about belonging. And until someone faces that honestly, they remain trapped in endless performance. But there is another danger Jung warned about that often appears after unsupported people stop chasing validation. Isolation, not healthy solitude. Isolation disguised as strength. This happens when someone becomes so wounded by unsupportedness that they decide needing people at all is weakness. So they build walls, emotional walls, psychological walls, relational walls. They convince themselves independence means never relying on anyone. Again, never opening fully, never needing support, never risking disappointment. And for a while, this feels powerful too, because detachment can imitate strength. But Jung was very clear about something most people misunderstand. Individuation is not isolation. Becoming psychologically whole does not mean becoming emotionally unreachable. The sovereign people Jung admired were not emotionally closed. They were emotionally self-responsible. That is completely different. They could still love deeply, still connect, still trust selectively, but their identity no longer collapsed when support disappeared. They learned how to remain connected without becoming dependent, and that balance is incredibly rare, because unsupported people usually swing between two extremes: desperate attachment or complete emotional withdrawal. But sovereignty exists in neither extreme, it exists in the middle. The ability to remain open without abandoning yourself. The ability to accept love without requiring it to define your worth. The ability to walk alone when necessary, without convincing yourself you no longer need human connection at all. And reaching that balance changes the entire quality of a person's life. Because now they are no longer reacting to abandonment. They are finally living from choice. The people who truly became sovereign did not reject human connection completely. That is one of the biggest misunderstandings Jung tried to correct. Unsupported people often swing violently between two extremes. First, they desperately seek validation everywhere. Then, after enough disappointment, betrayal, rejection, or emotional neglect, they swing to the opposite side entirely and convince themselves they no longer need anyone at all. But that is not healing. That is self-protection hardened into identity. Jung noticed that many emotionally wounded people became attached to isolation, because isolation felt safer than vulnerability. If no one gets close to you, no one can abandon you. If you never depend on anyone emotionally, no one can disappoint you. If you convince yourself you don't need support, then unsupportedness stops feeling painful, at least temporarily. But psychological numbness is not the same thing as strength, and emotional isolation often disguises itself as independence very convincingly. You see this everywhere. People calling emotional shutdown discipline, calling avoidance boundaries, calling distrust wisdom, calling detachment self-sufficiency. But Jung understood something most people never realize. The wound always tries to reinvent itself as philosophy. That is one of its favorite disguises. A person who is deeply unsupported begins telling themselves that needing people is weakness. They build emotional walls so high that nothing painful can reach them anymore. But eventually something else disappears too. Intimacy, connection, warmth, the ability to be truly seen. And slowly they begin confusing loneliness with power. Jung would have seen this as another shadow adaptation, not true sovereignty, because true sovereignty does not require emotional starvation. The sovereign individuals Jung admired still valued connection deeply. They still loved, still trusted carefully, still formed meaningful relationships. The difference was that their identity no longer depended entirely on those relationships surviving. That distinction changes everything. Because dependency says, if you leave, I collapse. Sovereignty says, if you leave, it will hurt deeply, but I will remain myself. And that is a completely different psychological structure. Unsupported people often struggle to understand this because abandonment teaches the nervous system that closeness equals danger, especially when the very first relationships in life were unstable, neglectful, dismissive, or emotionally unsafe. The child learns, people cannot be trusted, and eventually that belief becomes unconscious law. So even later in life, when healthy connection becomes possible, the wound still whispers, don't trust too much, don't need too much, don't open completely. People always leave eventually. And the tragic part is that this survival strategy often works just well enough to become permanent. The person avoids abandonment by avoiding genuine closeness entirely. But Jung believed that individuation was never meant to end in emotional isolation. Quite the opposite. Real individuation creates the ability to relate more honestly because you are no longer entering relationships from desperation. You are no longer asking another human being to rescue your identity. You stop treating love like emotional oxygen and start experiencing it as connection between two whole people, rather than two wounds trying to repair each other. That is why sovereign people become selective instead of closed. Selective means not everyone receives access, not everyone deserves trust, not everyone is psychologically capable of seeing you clearly, and unsupported people must learn this carefully because many of them spent years overgiving emotionally in order to finally receive the validation they never got naturally. Jung observed this pattern often. Unsupported individuals frequently become hyper-attuned to other people's needs. They become the listener, the helper, the emotionally available one. They unconsciously believe that if they become useful enough, supportive enough, understanding enough, someone will eventually reciprocate the care they were denied themselves. But this creates dangerous relational blindness, because wounded people often confuse emotional intensity with emotional safety. They keep giving themselves to people who can receive love, but cannot return it, and eventually exhaustion sets in. Not because they are weak, but because one-sided emotional labor slowly destroys the psyche. This is why sovereignty requires discernment. You must learn the difference between people who are capable of genuine reciprocity and people who simply consume your energy. Jung believed psychologically mature people develop this discernment gradually. They stop trying to earn love through sacrifice. Stop over-explaining themselves to people committed to misunderstanding them. Stop chasing emotional availability from people who repeatedly demonstrate emotional absence. And this changes relationships profoundly, because for the first time, the unsupported person stops asking, "How do I make people stay?" and starts asking, "Who actually deserves access to me?" That question marks the beginning of self-respect, not arrogance, not superiority, self-respect. And unsupported people often struggle with self-respect because years of emotional neglect trained them to tolerate things that psychologically healthy individuals would immediately recognize as unacceptable. They tolerate inconsistency, emotional unavailability, disrespect, lack of reciprocity, being unseen, being used. Because part of them still believes, at least this is something. But sovereignty slowly dismantles that belief. It teaches the nervous system that loneliness is painful, but self-betrayal is worse. And once someone truly learns that, Their entire relationship with connection changes. They stop abandoning themselves in order to preserve attachment. That is one of the deepest transformations Jung ever described psychologically. But another trap appears here too: bitterness. And bitterness is dangerous because it often feels intelligent. After years of unsupportedness, many people begin developing contempt disguised as wisdom. They look at supported people and secretly resent them. They tell themselves anyone who received encouragement had an easier life. That emotionally supported individuals are soft, dependent, weaker somehow. This bitterness creates a false sense of superiority. And Jung recognized it immediately as projection, because underneath the contempt is usually unresolved grief. Grief for what they themselves never received. If someone else's support triggers anger in you, pay attention to that. Not with shame, with honesty. Because resentment towards supported people often reveals an abandoned part of yourself still mourning what it needed and never had. And Jung believed healing required facing that grief directly rather than converting it into cynicism. Cynicism feels protective. It says, expect nothing from anyone, trust no one. People are disappointing. But over time, cynicism slowly poisons the psyche because it cuts the person off from hope itself. And without hope, life becomes psychologically mechanical, productive perhaps, functional perhaps, but emotionally lifeless. The sovereign people Jung admired were not cynical. They were realistic. There is a huge difference. Cynicism closes the heart permanently. Realism simply learns discernment. A sovereign person can acknowledge, support is valuable, love matters, healthy relationships matter deeply, while also understanding, my life cannot depend entirely on receiving those things, perfectly. That balance is rare, and if you're recognizing yourself somewhere in this, in the proving wound, the emotional isolation, the resentment, the endless need to perform, the fear of needing people, the exhaustion of carrying yourself alone, that recognition matters more than you think. Because awareness is where psychological freedom begins. Most people spend their entire lives running unconscious patterns without ever seeing them clearly enough to interrupt them. But the moment you can observe the wound without becoming consumed by it, something changes. Jung believed consciousness itself is transformative. Not instantly, not magically, but gradually. The moment you become conscious of a pattern, you are no longer completely controlled by it. And that is the beginning of building from the inside out. Not through self-hype, not through pretending the pain never existed, but through honest self-observation. This is why Jung emphasized practices of internal witnessing so heavily. Because unsupported people often lose trust in their own perception. When no one validates your experience consistently, you begin doubting yourself automatically. You minimize your own pain, question your own memories, dismiss your own effort because nobody else acknowledged it. And over time, this creates psychological instability. The person stops trusting their own inner reality. Everything must be externally confirmed before it feels real. Jung saw this clearly. That is why one of the first practices sovereign individuals develop is self-witnessing, not self-praise, not ego-inflation, self-witnessing, the ability to accurately recognize your own experience without requiring someone else to certify it first. You know what you've survived. You know what something cost you emotionally. You know when you've grown. You know when you've acted with integrity. And slowly, through repeated acts of honest self-recognition, unsupported people begin rebuilding something they were never properly given. Internal authority. Not loud confidence, not performance. A quiet relationship with themselves rooted in truth rather than applause. And once that relationship begins forming, life changes in ways that are almost impossible to explain to people who still depend entirely on external validation to know who they are. Most people spend their entire lives waiting for permission before they fully become themselves. Permission to begin, permission to change, permission to dream bigger, permission to walk away from environments that are slowly destroying them. And perhaps most dangerously of all, permission to believe in themselves before the world does. Carl Jung understood something deeply uncomfortable about human nature. Most people do not actually trust their own perception. They trust mirrors, they trust applause, they trust approval, they trust consensus. If enough people validate them, they feel confident. If enough people doubt them, they begin doubting themselves too. Their identity shifts constantly, depending on how the external world reacts to them. And this creates a fragile life. Because a person who only believes in themselves when others do, does not truly believe in themselves at all. They believe in reflection. Jung noticed that the strongest individuals psychologically were often the people who had been deprived of reflection for so long that they were eventually forced to develop something far more stable: internal authority. Not arrogance, not ego, not loud confidence, something much quieter. A relationship with themselves that no longer depended entirely on external confirmation. And that relationship changes the entire structure of a person's life. Because once someone stops waiting to be emotionally approved before acting, their path finally becomes their own. But this transformation almost never begins beautifully. It usually begins in loneliness, in silence, in years of feeling unseen. Unsupported people know this feeling intimately. The feeling of carrying enormous internal weight while nobody around them fully understands what they are going through. The feeling of struggling quietly while the world continues moving as if nothing inside them is breaking. The feeling of achieving things nobody celebrates because nobody was paying attention closely enough to notice how difficult those things actually were. And after enough time living this way, something dangerous begins happening psychologically. The unsupported person slowly starts disconnecting from their own reality. Because human beings naturally learn who they are through emotional reflection. Someone notices your effort and you learn your effort matters. Someone validates your pain and you learn your suffering is real. Someone encourages your growth and you begin trusting your potential. But when these reflections are absent, identity becomes unstable. You begin minimizing yourself automatically. Maybe it wasn't that difficult. Maybe I'm being dramatic. Maybe my pain isn't legitimate. Maybe my exhaustion means weakness. And over time, this self-doubt becomes so automatic that the person stops trusting their own inner experience entirely. Jung saw this constantly in people who grew up emotionally unsupported. Their greatest struggle was not lack of intelligence or capability. It was the inability to internally validate themselves without outside permission. That is why Jung emphasized self-witnessing so heavily, because unsupported people must eventually learn how to become conscious observers of their own reality. Not in an egotistical way, in an honest way. You know what you survived. You know what something cost you emotionally. You know how hard you worked even when nobody acknowledged it. You know how many nights you spent fighting battles silently inside your own mind while still functioning externally. And slowly, through repeated acts of internal honesty, the unsupported person begins rebuilding trust with themselves. That trust is incredibly important psychologically, because once someone no longer requires constant external confirmation to recognize their own effort, something inside them stabilizes. They stop emotionally collapsing every time the world fails to notice them. They stop abandoning themselves simply because nobody else validated their experience first. And this is where inner authority begins forming. Not through motivational speeches, not through fake confidence. Through repeated acts of truthful self-recognition. Jung believed this process was essential because unsupported people often internalize deeply destructive voices from their environment: the critical parent, the dismissive partner, the teacher who made them feel small, the friend who mocked their dreams. Over time, these external voices become internal voices, and eventually the unsupported person begins psychologically attacking themselves using language that was originally given to them by wounded people around them. You'll never make it. Who do you think you are? You're unrealistic. You're too much. Nobody cares. At first, these voices feel like truth, but Jung understood that many of them are not truth at all. They are psychological residues, fragments of other people's fear, limitation, bitterness, and emotional immaturity absorbed into the psyche over years of repetition. And sovereign individuals eventually realize something crucial. If they do not consciously rebuild their internal world, their wounds will rule it forever. That rebuilding requires intention. Jung sometimes described this as developing an internal counsel, a wiser psychological structure capable of guiding the individual when external guidance is absent. This is not fantasy. It is psychological architecture, because unsupported people spend enormous portions of their lives alone internally. If the only voice inside them is harshness, eventually the nervous system becomes exhausted from permanent self-conflict. So sovereign individuals begin cultivating different internal voices consciously. Not delusional positivity, not empty affirmations. Wisdom. Maybe they remember the voice of one person who once genuinely believed in them years ago. Maybe they imagine the future version of themselves who already survived the current struggle speaking backward through time. Maybe they slowly develop the ability to speak to themselves with the same clarity and steadiness they offer others naturally. And over time, the entire inner atmosphere changes. The unsupported person stops becoming their own executioner and begins becoming their own witness. That shift is life-changing, because people who constantly attack themselves internally eventually lose the energy required to build anything meaningful externally. Jung believed inner warfare drains enormous psychological energy, and unsupported people frequently live in permanent internal warfare without realizing it. One part of them wants to grow, another part says, "What's the point?" One part dreams bigger, another part repeats every voice that ever doubted them. One part wants peace, another part remains addicted to proving itself endlessly. This fragmentation creates exhaustion. Not physical exhaustion only, existential exhaustion. The feeling of constantly carrying yourself through life while simultaneously fighting yourself internally every step of the way. But sovereignty begins reducing this fragmentation, slowly, painfully, through awareness. Because the moment someone becomes conscious of these internal dynamics, they stop being completely controlled by them. And Jung believed consciousness itself was transformative, not instantly, not magically, but gradually. The unsupported person begins recognizing that voice is not truth, that fear is not my identity, that shame was inherited, that self-hatred was learned. And this awareness creates distance between the individual and the wound. Distance creates choice, and choice changes everything psychologically. Because now the person can begin asking deeper questions. Why am I actually pursuing this? Is this dream genuinely mine? Or an attempt to finally become worthy enough? Would I still want this path if nobody applauded me for it? These questions terrify most people because they expose hidden motivations. Jung believed many highly ambitious individuals were secretly driven by emotional starvation rather than authentic purpose. The person says, "I want success," but unconsciously means, "I want to finally feel enough." The person says, "I want recognition," but deeper down means, "I want someone to finally see me." And until these hidden motives become conscious, achievement itself often becomes emotionally exhausting, because no accomplishment can permanently heal a wound that was never honestly faced. That is why unsupported people often feel strangely empty even after succeeding. The achievement happened, but the emotional hunger remained. Because success cannot retroactively create the love, safety, and encouragement that were absent earlier in life. Jung understood this deeply, and this is why sovereign individuals eventually stop building their lives entirely around proving themselves. Not because they lose ambition, because ambition itself becomes purified, cleaner, less desperate, less emotionally loaded. The work stops being, "Please finally see my value," and becomes, "This is genuinely who I am." That distinction changes the entire emotional experience of life. The sovereign person still works hard, still grows, still builds, still dreams, but there is less panic underneath everything, less unconscious begging for validation hidden inside achievement. And ironically, this often makes their work far more powerful, because now it comes from alignment instead of emotional survival. Jung believed human beings become psychologically dangerous in the best possible sense when they stop organizing their lives entirely around external reaction. Because now rejection no longer destroys identity completely, criticism no longer erases self-worth, silence no longer automatically means failure. The unsupported person begins realizing something extraordinary. They can continue moving forward even without applause. And once someone truly learns that, their life changes forever. Most people spend their lives performing without realizing they are performing. Performing strength. performing confidence, performing success, performing versions of themselves they hope will finally be accepted, admired, respected, or loved. And Jung believed this performance slowly fractures the psyche, because the further someone moves away from what is authentic internally, the more exhausting existence itself becomes. That exhaustion is difficult to explain to people who have never experienced it deeply. It is not ordinary tiredness. It is the exhaustion of constantly shaping yourself around external reaction, watching faces, monitoring approval, adjusting personality, measuring worth through response, trying endlessly to become someone the world will finally validate. Unsupported people know this exhaustion intimately because many of them learned very early that survival depended on adapting themselves to other people's expectations. Some became hyperachievers, some became caretakers, some became emotionally invisible, some became perfectionists. But underneath all those adaptations was usually the same unconscious question: what version of me will finally deserve support? Jung understood that this question quietly controls enormous portions of human behavior. Most people never fully become themselves because they are too busy becoming psychologically acceptable, and the tragedy is that external validation is never stable enough to build identity upon permanently. The crowd changes, people leave, attention fades, approval shifts. What was admired yesterday becomes criticized tomorrow, so the person trapped in performance becomes psychologically unstable because their sense of self constantly fluctuates with external reaction. But sovereign individuals eventually stop organizing their lives around being seen correctly by everyone else, and that changes the energy they project into the world completely. There is something unmistakable about a person who is no longer desperately asking reality for permission to exist. Jung noticed this repeatedly. The unsupported individuals who eventually developed genuine internal authority carried a different presence, less grasping, less performance, less unconscious need to convince everyone around them of their value. And ironically, that authenticity often attracted healthier support naturally. Not because the universe magically rewards self-sufficiency. Jung would have rejected simplistic thinking like that. The change was psychological. When someone stops performing for validation, they become emotionally clearer, more grounded, more honest. Their energy stops scattering in 100 directions, trying to gain approval from people who cannot provide stable identity anyway. And other people feel this instinctively. Because authenticity has psychological weight, most human interaction is filled with subtle performance. People trying to appear stronger than they are, smarter than they are, more successful, more emotionally unaffected, more certain. But when someone genuinely stops performing, there is a quietness in them that feels different. Not passive, not weak, solid. And psychologically healthy people are naturally drawn towards solidity, especially in a world filled with performance exhaustion. But Jung warned carefully about something dangerous here. The moment authenticity itself becomes another strategy for gaining validation, the person falls directly back into the same trap again. This is incredibly important to understand. Many unsupported people unconsciously transform healing into performance too. They begin thinking, if I become whole enough, then people will finally support me. If I become authentic enough, then I will finally receive the love I lacked. But this is still external orientation disguised as inner work, still bargaining emotionally with reality, still trying to exchange transformation for validation. And Jung believed true sovereignty begins only when the bargaining finally ends, when someone stops asking, what can I become so the world finally approves of me, and begins asking, what feels true regardless of approval. That shift changes everything internally, because now life stops being organized around audience reaction. The work becomes meaningful even in silence. Effort becomes valuable even when unnoticed. Growth becomes real even when nobody applauds it. And this is the point most people never reach psychologically. The point where action is no longer emotionally dependent on being witnessed constantly. Jung believed this was one of the deepest forms of freedom available to human beings. The ability to move toward what matters internally even when external validation is absent. Not because praise feels bad, not because support doesn't matter, but because identity no longer collapses in its absence. This changes the entire definition of winning. Most people define winning externally: money, recognition, status, influence, attention. And none of these things are inherently wrong. Jung was not anti-success, but he observed something profound about externally successful people who remained psychologically dependent on validation. No matter how much they achieved, they still felt fragile internally, because their emotional center remained outside themselves. One criticism could destabilize them completely. One rejection could reopen years of unresolved insecurity. One period of silence could trigger panic. Externally successful, internally unanchored. But sovereign individuals eventually discovered a completely different form of victory. Invisible victory. The victory of no longer waking up desperate for recognition. The victory of creating something meaningful without compulsively checking whether anyone noticed. The victory of being alone without feeling emotionally abandoned by yourself. The victory of no longer needing to constantly prove your existence through achievement. Jung believed these victories mattered far more psychologically than public success ever could, because they represented wholeness, not performance, wholeness. And wholeness is quiet. The world rarely celebrates it because it often happens internally, long before anything changes externally. Nobody throws a parade for the person who finally stopped hating themselves. Nobody applauds the moment someone releases the fantasy that achievement will finally heal every wound. Nobody sees the night a person finally sits alone in silence without feeling empty for the first time in years. But Jung believed these moments represented profound psychological transformation, because the unsupported person slowly stops building identity around what was missing and begins building identity around what remains. The part that survived, the part that continued, the part that kept moving forward despite exhaustion, loneliness, disappointment, and silence. That part matters enormously, and unsupported people often underestimate it because they became so focused on what they lacked that they stopped recognizing the strength already present inside them. Jung spent decades studying people under extraordinary psychological pressure, and he found something remarkable repeatedly. The psyche contains hidden resources most people never discover because they never have to look for them deeply enough. Supported people often remain externally oriented because external structures continuously stabilize them. But unsupported individuals are eventually forced inward. And inward confrontation changes a human being profoundly. Because once external validation disappears long enough, the person eventually reaches a terrifying psychological threshold. Either they discover something real within themselves, or they collapse entirely into emptiness. Jung believed this confrontation, painful as it was, often became the birthplace of genuine selfhood. Not idealized selfhood, real selfhood, the kind built slowly in silence without applause, the kind that does not disappear the moment external support is withdrawn. And this is why unsupported people often become psychologically deeper than others realize. Not automatically. Pain alone does not create wisdom. Many people become bitter instead. But individuals who consciously face the loneliness rather than running endlessly from it often discover parts of themselves inaccessible through comfort alone. They discover endurance, discernment, internal authority, emotional depth, the ability to stand psychologically without constant external reinforcement. And perhaps most importantly, they discover that the support they spent years searching for externally had already been expressing itself internally the entire time, in the part of them that refused to completely give up. Think about that, carefully. Despite everything, something inside you kept moving, even when no one encouraged you, even when nobody believed in your direction, even when you questioned yourself repeatedly, even when exhaustion made stopping feel easier. Something remained alive inside you anyway. Jung would have considered that deeply significant psychologically, because the psyche does not continue reaching toward meaning accidentally. The fact that you are still trying, still searching, still refusing complete surrender, means there is something inside you that has not abandoned itself yet, and that part deserves far more attention than the voices telling you that unsupportedness made you weak. Because perhaps the greatest lie unsupported people believe is that being alone means being powerless. Jung discovered the opposite was often true. Sometimes isolation strips away every false identity until the individual is finally forced to encounter the only thing capable of carrying them permanently, their own deepest self. And once someone truly begins building from there, their life no longer belongs to the wound. It finally begins belonging to them. Most people spend years believing strength means never struggling, never doubting, never feeling lonely, never needing reassurance. But Jung understood something far more honest about human transformation. Real strength is usually born in places where nobody is clapping for you. In silence, in uncertainty, in long periods where externally it looks like nothing is happening, while internally an entire identity is being rebuilt from the ground up. Unsupported people know these places intimately. The nights where no one checks on you. The moments where you question whether continuing even matters. The exhaustion of carrying dreams nobody around you fully understands. The strange loneliness of trying to become someone different while everyone else keeps relating to older versions of you that no longer fit. And yet, despite all of this, something inside you continues reaching forward anyway. Jung would have considered that profoundly important, because the psyche does not continue moving toward growth accidentally. Something in you has continued choosing life repeatedly, even when encouragement was absent, even when support never arrived, even when nobody noticed how hard the process actually was. That persistence matters more than you think. Most unsupported people spend so much time focusing on what they lacked that they stop recognizing the strength already present inside them. But Jung believed the deepest parts of the self often reveal themselves only after illusion collapses. And one of the biggest illusions many people carry is the belief that they need external permission before they are allowed to fully become themselves. Permission from parents, permission from society, permission from relationships, permission from the crowd. But eventually unsupported individuals reach a breaking point psychologically where they realize something irreversible. If they keep waiting for permission, their real life will never begin. That realization changes a person completely, because now growth stops being theoretical. It becomes necessary. The unsupported person slowly understands that nobody is coming to emotionally rescue them into becoming who they are supposed to be. And, while that realization hurts deeply at first, it also contains freedom, because once you stop waiting for rescue, something inside you finally begins moving differently, more honestly, more directly, more intentionally. You stop asking, "Who will support me?" and begin asking, "What kind of person do I become if I finally support myself?" That question changes the center of gravity inside the psyche. Because support is not only external, Jung understood that psychologically, mature individuals eventually develop the capacity to hold themselves internally through difficult transformations. Not perfectly, not without pain, but consciously. They learn how to remain present with themselves instead of abandoning themselves emotionally every time life becomes difficult. And unsupported people often struggle with this because abandonment conditions the nervous system to self-abandon automatically. The moment they fail, they attack themselves. The moment they feel weak, they shame themselves. The moment they become exhausted, they accuse themselves of inadequacy. But sovereignty interrupts this cycle. It teaches the individual how to remain loyal to themselves even during uncertainty. That loyalty is incredibly important psychologically, because many unsupported people were taught, directly or indirectly, that their value depended entirely on performance. If they succeeded, they deserved attention. If they struggled, they became invisible. And eventually they internalized this dynamic so deeply that they only offered compassion to themselves conditionally. Only when productive, only when impressive, only when achieving. But Jung believed real integration begins when someone stops relating to themselves exclusively through performance. When they stop asking, "Am I successful enough to deserve self-worth?" and begin asking, "Can I remain connected to myself even while imperfect, uncertain, unfinished, and still becoming?" That is an entirely different form of psychological development, because now identity is no longer built solely around accomplishment. It becomes rooted in relationship with the self, and once that relationship strengthens, life changes in subtle but profound ways. The unsupported person becomes less fragile emotionally, not because pain disappears, because their entire nervous system no longer depends completely on external reinforcement in order to remain stable. Rejection still hurts, loneliness still hurts, failure still hurts, but they stop interpreting those experiences as proof of worthlessness. That distinction changes everything. Jung believed suffering becomes psychologically destructive, primarily when meaning collapses, when pain feels empty, pointless, proof that something is fundamentally wrong with you. But unsupported individuals who consciously move through transformation eventually discover something extraordinary. Their suffering forged capacities inside them that comfort alone could never have created. Depth, discernment, self-awareness, emotional endurance, the ability to sit alone with difficult truths without immediately escaping into distraction. And, perhaps most importantly, the ability to continue moving forward even in silence. That capacity is rare, far rarer than people realize. Most human beings require constant external reinforcement to sustain difficult paths. Remove applause, remove attention, remove encouragement, and many people abandon themselves quickly because they never developed internal stability independent of external reaction. But unsupported individuals are forced to discover another source entirely: internal conviction. And conviction built internally carries a different quality. It is quieter, less performative, less desperate for visibility, because it was not created through applause. It was created through repeated moments of choosing yourself when nobody else did. Jung would have seen enormous psychological significance in that process, because every time you continue without external reinforcement, you strengthen your relationship with your own inner authority. Every time you act from truth instead of approval, identity becomes more integrated. Every time you stop betraying yourself in order to maintain belonging, the psyche becomes more whole. And wholeness, not perfection, was always Jung's real goal. Not becoming flawless, not becoming endlessly successful, becoming integrated, becoming real, becoming someone whose inner life is no longer fragmented by constant performance, fear, resentment, and dependency on external validation. That kind of transformation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. Most of it happens invisibly, quietly, internally. No audience sees the moment someone finally stops begging emotionally for approval. No one applauds when a person releases years of resentment and begins building from authenticity instead. No one notices the night someone sits alone and realizes, I do not need to become someone else in order to deserve my own loyalty. But Jung believed those invisible moments were often the most important moments of a person's entire life, because identity changes silently long before circumstances do, and unsupported people often underestimate the magnitude of what they are surviving psychologically because nobody externally reflects its significance back to them. So let this be said clearly: surviving unsupportedness without becoming permanently bitter is an extraordinary act of consciousness. Remaining open after disappointment is extraordinary. Continuing to hope after years of silence is extraordinary. Choosing authenticity over performance is extraordinary. And the fact that some part of you still wants to build something meaningful despite everything you've experienced matters enormously. Because that part of you is not weakness. It is evidence. Evidence that something essential inside you has refused complete surrender. Jung believed the deepest self is always trying to move toward wholeness even when the conscious mind feels lost. And perhaps that is what has been happening inside you all along. Not failure, not punishment, transformation. Painful, lonely, slow, but real. Because unsupportedness strips away illusion eventually. It forces confrontation with questions most people spend their lives avoiding. Who are you when nobody validates you? What remains when applause disappears? Can you still move toward what matters without guarantees? Can you still believe in your path before the world reflects belief back to you? Those questions terrify most people, but they also create depth, and depth changes a human being forever. Because eventually the unsupported person realizes something profound. The support they kept searching for externally had already been expressing itself internally the entire time. In the part of them that kept trying, kept creating, kept surviving, kept reaching forward through exhaustion. That part deserves Trust, not blind confidence, trust, because it carried you here. And maybe that is the real victory Jung was pointing toward all along. Not becoming admired enough to erase the wound. Not becoming successful enough to finally silence insecurity forever. But becoming internally grounded enough that your life no longer depends entirely on external reaction to feel meaningful. That is real freedom psychologically, the freedom to create without constant approval, to continue without applause, to remain yourself even when misunderstood, to build quietly from authenticity instead of loudly from pain. And once someone truly begins living that way, their life stops belonging to the wound. It finally begins belonging to the person they were always becoming underneath it.